If you ask someone, where did modern China's economic system begin, they'll most likely say Mao. If they are a bit more informed, they'll say Deng Xiaoping. Most people point to communism. But almost no one remembers the man who came before all of them. And yet, without understanding him, it's very hard to understand China today. Because before China became communist, before it shifted to capitalism with Chinese characteristics, before it became the factory of the world, it was actually something far more fragile. Its economy was being hollowed out from the inside. It was politically fragmented, financially dependent on the outside. And worst of all, everyone knew the old system was collapsing, but no one knew how to stop it. The person who saw this most clearly wasn't a general. He wasn't a warlord. He definitely wasn't a Marxist. He was actually a doctor. But circumstances forced him to become an economist. Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen didn't step forward just to overthrow an emperor. He wasn't driven by a simple idea like out with the old, in with the new. He was chasing a much more uncomfortable question. How did China, after centuries as one of the richest and most advanced civilizations on Earth, become so economically weak in the modern world? To understand that question, we can't look at slogans or myths. We have to look straight at the balance sheet. By the late 19th century, China wasn't starving to death. It wasn't completely backward either. But structurally, it didn't fit the new world at all. The country was still overwhelmingly agrarian. Land was fragmented. Productivity was uneven. Wealth existed, but it was scattered. The state couldn't collect it, direct it, or turn it into large-scale investment. There was no national market. Revenues stayed local. Regional interests came before everything else. Capital accumulation existed, but it was unplanned, disconnected, and stateless.
Meanwhile, the rest of the world had moved on to a completely different game. Europe, America, Japan, all had built centralized tax systems. They had debt markets, banking, industry, trade networks protected by navies. Capital was moving faster than armies ever could. China didn't fall behind because it became lazy. It fell behind because it couldn't coordinate. The consequences were harsh. Foreign powers didn't just defeat China on the battlefield. They hollowed it out economically. Customs revenues fell under foreign control. Ports operated by foreign rules. Trade terms were dictated, not negotiated. China couldn't even set tariffs to protect its own industry. Debt piled up, but there were no institutions capable of managing it. Sun Yat-sen grew up watching this picture unfold. And he didn't romanticize the past. He didn't say, let's go back to the old days. He didn't believe copying the West wholesale would magically save China either. His starting point was very clear: without fixing the economy, politics is just a stage performance. If a country can't finance itself, elections mean nothing. If there's no infrastructure, constitutions are just paper. Ideals collapse the moment the first real crisis hits. So Sun asked this question: how could China become economically independent again? His answer is known as the three principles of the people. They're usually taught as political philosophy, but in reality, they were an economic roadmap. The first was nationalism. But this wasn't about identity. It was about control. Control over trade, control over revenue, control over destiny. Sun believed that without economic independence, political independence was just window dressing, and in that, he was largely right. The second was democracy. But Sun didn't see it as urgent. Not because he opposed democracy, but because he opposed bad timing. He didn't believe a starving, indebted, fragmented country could vote itself into freedom.
To him, that was an invitation to chaos. The third, and most important, was the people's livelihood. This is where Sun becomes genuinely interesting. He never believed free markets alone could save China. But he also knew that eliminating markets entirely wasn't the answer either. What he wanted was coordination. Land reform, because rent-seeking was choking productivity. State-led infrastructure, because the country wasn't connected. Public control over railways, energy, and basic industry, not to destroy profit, but to prevent private monopolies from locking up national development. He wanted capital to exist, but not for short-term gains. It should serve long-term national goals. Credit should flow into ports, railways, electricity, and industry, not speculation. This wasn't classical socialism, and it wasn't Anglo-American capitalism either. It was an early version of what we now call developmental economics. Sun's problem wasn't ideology. It was time. And time requires stability. But Sun's greatest misfortune was this: he never had a state capable of implementing his system. China collapsed, but nothing solid replaced it. The country fragmented. Revenues were divided. Warlords carved everything up. Capital fled. Infrastructure stalled. And as always, the people paid the price. Sun's ideas didn't fail because they were wrong. They failed because they were early. Into that vacuum stepped simpler answers. Harsher ideologies. Promises of faster solutions. When institutions are weak, extremism always sounds like clarity. And most narratives jump straight from here to communism. But a lot of things survived from Sunday. The obsession with infrastructure. Suspicion toward foreign capital. The idea that markets shouldn't be unleashed, but guided. The belief that political legitimacy comes from tangible prosperity.